Hey y'all, it's entry number 78 of this off-season series where we discuss a different player's fantasy value each day as a group. We are another day closer to the start of the 2022 NFL season. Each day we'll drop a name, go through some positives and some concerns of their fantasy profile, and then I'll give my personal opinion at the end. Today's discussion will be on Travis Kelce, tight end, Kansas City Chiefs. We'll start with the positives with Travis Kelce's fantasy profile, year-to-year consistency and durability. Travis Kelce has been the definition of consistency at the tight end position, finishing as a top 2 fantasy tight end in all formats every year since 2016. He's gone for 1,000 or more receiving yards in each of the last 6 seasons, and has had at least 850 receiving yards in every season since 2014. He hasn't missed many games in his career since he broke out in 2014, playing in 126 of a possible 129 games during this time, or 97.67%. He's clearly a great option if you're looking for a safe pick. The next thing I really like about Travis Kelce's fantasy profile is that he's got an elite quarterback. Travis Kelce has one of the best quarterbacks in the league throwing him the ball, in Patrick Mahomes. Mahomes has averaged 301.4 passing yards and 2.40 passing touchdowns per game over the course of his career. And having a great quarterback like Mahomes throwing him the ball raises the fantasy floor and ceiling of Travis Kelce in 2022. The last major thing I really like about Travis Kelce's fantasy profile is that he's a target hog. Travis Kelce has consistently been one of the most targeted tight ends in the league over the course of his career, seeing 100 or more targets in every season since 2015, with 103 targets in 2015, 117 targets in 2016, 122 targets in 2017, 150 targets in 2018, 136 targets in 2019, 145 targets in 2020, and 134 targets in 2021 according to Pro Football Reference. Not many tight ends are capable of seeing this kind of workload, which makes Kelce an intriguing target in fantasy leagues for the 2022 season. Moving on to some of the concerns with Travis Kelce's fantasy profile. Age. Travis Kelce is currently 32 years old and will turn 33 in October. According to a Fantasy Pros article by fantasy football legend Mike Tagliere on tight end age declines, only 3 tight ends aged 30 or more over the last 15 years have finished as a top 3 fantasy tight end. Antonio Gates, Travis Kelce twice, and Tony Gonzalez 3 times. While future Hall of Famer, Travis Kelce has better odds than any tight end to continue to defy the falloff. This is still something that you should be a little worried about in 2022. The next concern I have with Travis Kelce's fantasy profile is his career low yards per target. Travis Kelce averaged a career low 8.4 yards per target during the 2021 season, which was the lowest mark of his career. Whenever an older player has a career low number like this, you have to wonder how far along they are on the decline curve. The last concern I have with Travis Kelce's fantasy profile this year is, will losing Tyreek Hill lead to defenses putting more emphasis on stopping Kelce than we've seen in the past few years? The Kansas City Chiefs traded away Tyreek Hill this offseason, while they added pass catchers Marquez Valdez-Scantling, Juju Smith-Schuster, and Sky Moore. None of those guys are even close to being in the same caliber of playmaking ability as Tyreek Hill. On one hand, you could argue that Hill leaving means that Kelce will see a ton of volume. On the other hand, you could argue that with Hill gone, teams can just focus on trying to shut down or slow down Kelce and challenge the Chiefs to beat them with their other weapons. Some additional thoughts on Travis Kelce's fantasy profile. During the 2021 season, Travis Kelce finished as the TE2 in standard with 170.8 total fantasy points and 10.7 fantasy points per game. The TE2 in half PPR with 216.8 total fantasy points and 13.6 fantasy points per game, and the TE2 in full PPR formats with 262.8 total fantasy points and 16.4 fantasy points per game according to Fantasy Pros. In half PPR formats, during the 2021 season, Travis Kelce had 4 out of 16 games with 0 to 5 fantasy points, 0 out of 16 games with 5 to 9.9 fantasy points, 6 out of 16 games with 10 to 15 fantasy points, 3 out of 16 games with 15 to 20 fantasy points, 2 out of 16 games with 20 to 25 fantasy points, and 1 out of 16 games with over 35 fantasy points according to fantasy data. During the 2020 season, Travis Kelce finished as the TE1 in standard with 207.8 total fantasy points and 13.9 fantasy points per game, the TE1 in half PPR formats with 260.3 total fantasy points and 17.4 fantasy points per game, and the TE1 in full PPR formats with 312.8 total fantasy points and 20.9 fantasy points per game according to Fantasy Pros. In half PPR formats, during the 2020 season, Travis Kelce had 1 out of 15 games with 0 to 5 fantasy points, 1 out of 15 games with 5 to 10 fantasy points, 3 out of 15 games with 10 to 15 fantasy points, 4 out of 15 games with 15 to 20 fantasy points, and 6 out of 15 games with 20 to 25 fantasy points according to fantasy data. Coaching. Over the course of Andy Reid's career, his tight end room as a whole has seen an average of 7.45 targets per game. Personal opinion. Travis Kelce is currently going off the board as TE1, about pick 22 overall on ESPN, and TE1, about pick 17 overall on Yahoo. While I do strategically prefer targeting one of the tight ends going in the 40s draft range, in Kyle Pitts, George Kittle, or Darren Waller, since you don't have as high an opportunity cost and still get a solid fantasy tight end with the potential to finish as the number 1 overall player at the position, Kelce is a strong draft target in the second round of fantasy leagues. There is a significant advantage in having a top-of-the-line tight end versus being forced to stream and hope that your guy somehow falls into the end zone. So getting a guy like Kelce, who is consistently a top 2 fantasy tight end, is pretty appealing at his ADP. For each of these entries, we will highlight a charitable cause or organization. Travis Kelce's My Cause My Cleats in 2020 was for the 87 and Running Foundation. Here's a link to that organization below. And that's it for today's entry. If you enjoyed this entry, be sure to like and subscribe.